The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Phoenix, Arizona, casting long shadows between the downtown skyscrapers as Jake Harrison stepped out of his rental car at Sky Harbor Airport. The 42-year-old former Army sergeant had flown in from Seattle to visit his younger brother Tommy's family for the first time in 3 years, their relationship finally healing after their father's funeral had driven a wedge between them over inheritance disputes. Jake adjusted his leather jacket against the desert heat, his weathered face showing the telltale signs of someone who had seen combat in Afghanistan, though he rarely spoke about those dark months in Kandahar. The airport seemed unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with fewer travelers than he remembered from previous visits, but he chalked it up to the economic downturn that had been plaguing the country for months. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy, "Emergency at work, can't pick you up. Take Uber to the house, Maria has lunch ready." Jake frowned, knowing his brother worked as a paramedic and emergencies were part of the job, but something in the terse message felt different, more urgent than usual. As he waited for his ride, Jake noticed several ambulances racing past the airport with their sirens wailing, followed by what appeared to be military vehicles, which struck him as odd since the nearest base was over an hour away. The Uber driver, a nervous man named Carlos, kept glancing at his phone and muttering in Spanish while navigating through increasingly chaotic traffic, with police cars blocking several intersections and helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his military instincts kicking in as he observed the patterns of emergency response vehicles. But Carlos just shook his head and turned up the radio, where a frantic news anchor was reporting multiple incidents of extreme violence across the city. The first real sign of trouble came when they turned onto Tommy Street and saw Mrs. Peterson, his brother's elderly neighbor, stumbling across her front lawn with what looked like severe injuries to her neck and arms, her movements jerky and unnatural as if she were sleepwalking. Jake immediately recognized the signs of shock and trauma from his combat experience, but something about her behavior seemed fundamentally wrong, predatory rather than victimized. He instructed Carlos to stop the car and stepped out, calling to Mrs. Peterson, but when she turned toward his voice, Jake felt his blood turn to ice. Her eyes were completely white, her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark blood covered her mouth and chin. She let out an inhuman growl and began shambling toward him with surprising speed, her broken fingernails reaching out like claws, and Jake realized with horrifying clarity that whatever had happened to her was beyond any medical emergency he had ever witnessed. Behind her, more figures emerged from houses along the street, all moving with that same unnatural gait, their clothes torn and bloodied, their faces bearing the unmistakable signs of death yet somehow still animate and hungry. Jake's military training took over as he backed toward the car, shouting for Carlos to drive, but the panicked driver had already shifted into reverse and was speeding away, leaving Jake stranded in what had become a nightmare scenario. He sprinted toward Tommy's house, dodging between abandoned cars and overturned trash cans, his heart pounding as he heard screams echoing from multiple directions and saw smoke rising from several buildings across the neighborhood. The front door of his brother's house stood wide open, hanging from its hinges as if it had been violently forced, and Jake could hear his nephew crying somewhere inside along with sounds of struggle that made his military experience seem like a training exercise compared to this unprecedented horror. As he reached for the service pistol he always carried, a habit from his army days that Tommy had always criticized, Jake realized that whatever was happening in Phoenix was spreading rapidly, systematically, and with a coordination that suggested this was no random outbreak of violence but something far more sinister and organized. The creatures pursuing him moved with purpose despite their apparent mindlessness, and in the distance he could hear the unmistakable sound of military aircraft approaching, which meant the government was already responding to what appeared to be a nationwide crisis that would test every survival skill he had learned in 2 decades of military service and civilian security work. Jake burst through the splintered doorway of his brother's house, his heart hammering as he heard his 4-year-old nephew Billy's terrified sobs coming from the kitchen, while the sounds of breaking glass and inhuman groans echoed from every direction outside the suburban home that had once represented safety and family normalcy. He found Tommy's wife Maria huddled in the pantry with Billy, both of them covered in dust and tears, and Maria immediately grabbed Jake's arm with desperate strength, whispering that Tommy had left for his paramedic shift early that morning and hadn't returned despite the chaos erupting across Phoenix. Through the kitchen window, Jake could see their neighbor Mr. Davidson, who had coached Billy's little league team just last weekend, now stumbling through the backyard with half his face missing, his EMT uniform torn and bloodied as he mindlessly clawed at the sliding glass door. Jake quickly ushered Maria and Billy toward the garage, grabbing emergency supplies from Tommy's well-stocked cabinets while explaining in calm, measured tones that they needed to leave immediately and find somewhere defensible until the military could restore order. As they loaded into Tommy's pickup truck, Jake's phone rang with a call from Marcus Rodriguez, his old Army communications buddy who now worked as a radio technician for the local emergency broadcast system, and Marcus's panicked voice revealed that the situation was far worse than anyone realized. "Jake, man, you need to get to the radio station downtown," Marcus said, his words tumbling over each other as explosions echoed in the background of his call. "I'm seeing reports coming in from across the country. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas. They're all going dark and the government's emergency protocols aren't working because whatever this is, it's hitting everywhere simultaneously." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this wasn't just a localized outbreak but a coordinated nationwide catastrophe that suggested either a massive terrorist attack or something even more sinister, while Maria clutched Billy tighter and asked what was happening to their world. The drive through Phoenix became a nightmare gauntlet of abandoned vehicles, burning buildings, and groups of infected people who moved with that same unnatural hunger Jake had witnessed at Mrs. Peterson's house, their numbers growing larger and more organized as they approached the city center. At a red light that no longer mattered in this new reality, Jake watched through his windshield as a young woman in a nurse's uniform stumbled out of Mercy General Hospital, her scrubs torn and bloody, followed by dozens of patients and staff members who had clearly succumbed to whatever infection was spreading through the population like wildfire. Maria screamed as one of the infected noticed their truck and began shambling toward them, followed by others who seemed drawn by the sound of the engine, and Jake gunned the accelerator, weaving between abandoned cars while Billy cried for his daddy and asked why all the people looked so scary and sick. When they finally reached the downtown emergency broadcast station, Jake found Marcus barricaded inside the building with two other survivors. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a CDC researcher who had been visiting Phoenix for a conference when the outbreak began, and Amy Sullivan, a 17-year-old girl whose parents had been killed in the initial chaos but who had managed to survive through quick thinking and remarkable composure for someone her age. Dr. Vasquez immediately began explaining what she had learned from her contacts at the CDC before communications went down, revealing that the infection showed signs of being artificially engineered rather than naturally occurring, with a transmission rate and symptom progression that defied normal biological patterns. "This isn't random," she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "Someone designed this pathogen to spread rapidly through major population centers, targeting the infrastructure and emergency response systems first." Amy, despite her youth, had already proven her value by securing additional supplies and identifying safe routes through the city using her knowledge of Phoenix's underground tunnel system, while Marcus continued monitoring emergency frequencies that painted an increasingly grim picture of America under siege. Through his military contacts, Jake learned that several major cities had gone completely silent, military bases were overwhelmed or compromised, and the president had been evacuated to an undisclosed location while the country's leadership struggled to coordinate a response to an enemy they didn't understand. As night fell over the burning city, the group realized they were witnessing the collapse of civilization as they knew it, but Dr. Vasquez's research data suggested there might be answers, and possibly hope, at the CDC's emergency facility in Colorado, where backup samples and research equipment could provide the key to understanding and potentially stopping the outbreak. Jake looked at his improvised family of survivors, knowing that their journey had only just begun and that the real test of their courage and humanity lay ahead in the dangerous trek across a country that was no longer recognizable as the America they had known and loved. 3 weeks after fleeing Phoenix, Jake's weathered group finally crested the rocky hills overlooking Denver, Colorado, where the sight that greeted them seemed like a mirage after their harrowing journey through the infected wasteland that America had become. The city had been transformed into a massive military fortress, with towering concrete walls topped by razor wire encircling the downtown area, while armed sentries patrolled watchtowers that cast searchlight beams across the surrounding terrain like mechanical eyes scanning for threats. Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he observed the disciplined movements of soldiers below, knowing from his military experience that such rapid fortification suggested both impressive organization and desperate circumstances that had forced the government to abandon large portions of the country. Dr. Vasquez clutched her research materials tighter as they approached the main checkpoint, where General Patricia Hayes, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, personally oversaw the processing of new arrivals with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions without hesitation. The general's welcoming speech to the survivors rang with patriotic fervor, but Jake noticed the underlying threat in her words about maintaining order and discipline, while Amy whispered that something felt wrong about how the guards separated families during the intake process. Inside the fortress walls, Denver had become a regimented society where civilians lived in assigned housing blocks, worked mandatory shifts supporting the military infrastructure, and followed strict curfews enforced by armed patrols who showed little tolerance for questions or complaints. Jake's heart nearly stopped when he spotted a familiar face among the civilian workers in the mess hall. His estranged daughter Nicole, now 25 and working as a nurse in the Fortress Medical Facility, her face lighting up with shock and joy when she saw her father for the first time since their bitter argument over his military deployment priorities 3 years earlier. Their emotional reunion was complicated by Nicole's revelation that life in the fortress, while safe from the infected, had become increasingly oppressive under General Hayes' leadership, with civilians disappearing for minor infractions and medical supplies being rationed in ways that seemed designed to maintain control rather than optimize care. Dr. Vasquez quickly established herself in the fortress laboratory, eager to continue her research with access to proper equipment, but she soon discovered that her work was being closely monitored by military personnel who seemed more interested in weaponizing her findings than developing a cure for the infection. Marcus found his communication skills in high demand as he helped coordinate with other fortress cities across the country, but the reports he intercepted painted a disturbing picture of similar authoritarian regimes emerging wherever military leaders had seized control in the name of emergency powers. Amy, despite her youth, proved remarkably adept at navigating the fortress's social dynamics, quickly identifying which guards could be trusted and which civilians were secretly organizing resistance to the increasingly harsh regulations that governed every aspect of daily life. During a late-night conversation in the medical facility, Nicole revealed to her father that General Hayes had been making disturbing comments about genetic superiority and the opportunity to rebuild America with only the strongest and most loyal citizens, while those deemed unfit or unreliable simply vanished from the fortress population. Jake's military instincts warned him that something was fundamentally wrong with the general's approach, especially when he learned that healthy civilians were being subjected to mysterious medical examinations that Dr. Vasquez was not permitted to oversee or review. The breaking point came when Dr. Vasquez discovered classified documents revealing that General Hayes had received advance warning about the outbreak from unnamed government sources, and rather than preventing the catastrophe, she had used the information to position herself as a regional warlord with ambitions of controlling the post-apocalyptic reconstruction. Amy overheard a conversation between Hayes and her lieutenants discussing plans to use captured infected as biological weapons against other survivor communities that refused to submit to the general's authority, a strategy that would essentially turn the zombie outbreak into a tool of conquest and genocide. When Jake confronted Dr. Vasquez with his growing suspicions about the fortress leadership, she revealed her most shocking discovery. The infection hadn't been released by foreign terrorists or emerged naturally, but had been developed by a rogue faction within the American military-industrial complex as part of a planned coup designed to overthrow the constitutional government and establish a new authoritarian regime. Marcus intercepted communications proving that similar fortress commanders across the country were coordinating their efforts to divide America into military-controlled territories, using the zombie crisis as justification for abandoning democratic principles and constitutional protections that had defined the nation for over 2 centuries. As Jake realized the full scope of the conspiracy surrounding them, he knew that his group faced an impossible choice between the relative safety of the fortress and the moral imperative to expose the truth, even if it meant venturing back into the infected wilderness with his daughter and the other survivors who had become his chosen family. The night air carried the sounds of the infected pressing against the fortress walls, but Jake understood now that the real monsters might be the ones inside the walls, wearing American uniforms and speaking of patriotism while planning the systematic destruction of everything America had once represented in the name of their twisted vision of order and control. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the classified documents Dr. Vasquez had smuggled from General Hayes' private laboratory, the pages revealing a conspiracy so vast and methodical that it made his years of combat experience seem naive compared to the calculated evil unfolding across America. The documents detailed Operation New Dawn, a coordinated plan involving multiple fortress commanders who had been secretly recruited years before the outbreak, their mission to use the zombie crisis as cover for establishing regional military dictatorships that would eventually unite under a single authoritarian government. Dr. Vasquez pointed to genetic profiles and population data that proved Hayes and her conspirators had deliberately chosen which communities to save and which to abandon based on racial, economic, and political criteria that would ensure their vision of a purified America. Nicole sat beside her father in the abandoned storage room where they had gathered for this clandestine meeting, her nurse's uniform still stained with the blood of patients she had been forced to watch die while medical supplies were redirected to support the general's personal agenda rather than genuine humanitarian needs. Marcus had intercepted radio communications revealing that fortress cities in Texas, Florida, and Virginia were already implementing similar policies, with their commanders coordinating supply chains and troop movements that had nothing to do with fighting the infected and everything to do with consolidating power over the surviving civilian population. Amy, despite her youth, had proven most effective at gathering intelligence through her ability to blend in with other young survivors, and her reconnaissance had uncovered the existence of detention facilities where civilians who questioned the fortress policies were subjected to medical experiments that Dr. Vasquez recognized as torture disguised as research. The breaking point came when Jake witnessed General Hayes personally ordering the execution of a family who had been caught trying to escape the fortress with evidence of the military's war crimes, their bodies displayed publicly as a warning to other civilians who might consider challenging the new order. That night, as Jake lay awake in his assigned barracks listening to the distant moans of the infected beyond the walls, he realized that staying silent would make him complicit in genocide, while speaking out would likely result in the death of everyone he had come to love during their desperate journey across the wasteland. Dr. Vasquez had managed to complete her analysis of the infection, discovering not only a potential cure but also evidence that the zombie virus contained artificial genetic markers that could be traced back to specific military bioweapons laboratories, proof that would expose the conspiracy if they could get the information to legitimate government authorities who still existed somewhere in the fractured remains of America. The plan they developed was risky beyond measure. Jake would use his military credentials to access the Fortress Communications Center. Marcus would broadcast Dr. Vasquez's findings to every surviving radio station across the country, while Amy and Nicole helped smuggle out as many civilians as possible through a maintenance tunnel that Amy had discovered during her exploration of the fortress infrastructure. Everything went wrong when General Hayes arrived at the communications center unexpectedly, accompanied by her most loyal officers, and Jake realized they had been betrayed by someone within their group who had reported their activities to the fortress security apparatus. Hayes smiled coldly as her soldiers surrounded Jake and Marcus, her voice dripping with false disappointment as she explained that she had known about their investigation from the beginning and had allowed it to continue only to identify other potential dissidents within the fortress population. "You still don't understand what we're building here," Hayes said, her eyes gleaming with fanatic intensity as she gestured toward the maps of America divided into military zones. "Democracy was always a failed experiment, and this crisis has given us the opportunity to create something stronger, more efficient, more pure than the corrupt system that allowed weakness to flourish for so long." Jake felt his heart sink as he realized that Dr. Vasquez and the others were probably already captured, but Hayes surprised him by revealing that the doctor had managed to escape with her research, though not before Hayes had obtained copies of the cure formula for her own purposes. The general's twisted logic became clear as she explained her intention to use both the zombie hordes and the cure as weapons of control, releasing the infected against communities that refused to submit while offering the cure only to those who proved their loyalty to the new regime. As Jake and Marcus were dragged toward the detention facilities, Hayes delivered her final blow by revealing that she had sent strike teams to capture Jake's daughter and the other escapees, intending to use them as leverage to force Dr. Vasquez to return with her research. The fortress walls that had once promised safety now felt like the barriers of a prison designed not to keep the infected out, but to keep the truth in, while Jake realized that the real battle for America's soul was just beginning and that the zombies shambling beyond the walls were merely the visible symptom of a much deeper rot that had infected the heart of the nation's leadership. In the darkness of his cell, listening to the screams of other prisoners and the mechanical sounds of Hayes' war machine preparing for its next phase of conquest, Jake understood that escaping the fortress would be only the first step in a much longer journey to reclaim the America that had been stolen from its people by those who wore its uniform while betraying everything it had once stood for. The rescue came in the form of explosions that shook the fortress walls at precisely 3 a.m, followed by the systematic failure of electrical systems that plunged the military compound into darkness while emergency sirens wailed like the screams of a dying beast. Jake had been counting the days of his imprisonment when the cell door suddenly swung open, revealing not General Hayes' soldiers but a group of blackened figures wearing night vision goggles and carrying military-grade weapons with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers who had turned against their corrupt leadership. The leader of the rescue team removed her helmet to reveal Dr. Vasquez, her face streaked with dirt and determination as she explained in rapid whispers that she had made contact with an underground resistance network that had been operating beneath the fortress for weeks, gathering intelligence and planning the liberation of political prisoners like Jake and Marcus. Behind her stood former Kansas City Police Chief Robert Kim, a Korean War veteran whose weathered face bore the scars of someone who had spent his career fighting for justice and wasn't about to stop now that his country needed him more than ever. Chief Kim quickly explained that his resistance cell operated from the abandoned subway tunnels beneath Kansas City, where they had established a sophisticated network of safe houses, communications equipment, and supply caches that allowed them to coordinate with similar groups across the Midwest who were fighting against the military conspiracy. As they navigated through maintenance tunnels that Amy had helped map during her earlier reconnaissance, Jake learned that Nicole and several other civilians had been successfully evacuated during the initial phase of the rescue operation, though many others remained trapped within the fortress walls under increasingly brutal conditions. The underground resistance had grown from a handful of concerned citizens to a coordinated movement involving former military personnel who had refused to participate in Operation New Dawn, civilian leaders who had escaped from other compromised fortress cities, and ordinary Americans who had witnessed the systematic destruction of constitutional government and decided to fight back. Chief Kim's intelligence network had uncovered evidence that General Hayes was not acting independently but was part of a larger conspiracy involving defense contractors, rogue intelligence operatives, and political extremists who had spent years planning to use a national crisis as justification for overthrowing the democratic system they viewed as weak and ineffective. Dr. Vasquez had spent her weeks in hiding analyzing the genetic structure of the zombie virus with equipment provided by sympathetic scientists within the resistance, and her research had confirmed that the infection was indeed artificial, designed with specific genetic triggers that could be activated or deactivated using targeted pharmaceutical compounds that the conspirators controlled. The resistance base beneath Kansas City resembled an underground city, with sleeping quarters carved from abandoned subway platforms, a medical facility staffed by doctors and nurses who had fled from corrupted fortress hospitals, and a communications center where Marcus immediately began coordinating with resistance cells in Chicago, Detroit, and Atlanta. Jake was amazed to discover that thousands of Americans had joined the underground movement, including active-duty soldiers who were secretly sabotaging military operations, government officials who were leaking classified information about the conspiracy, and civilian volunteers who risked their lives gathering intelligence and smuggling supplies to resistance operations across the country. Amy had proven herself invaluable to the resistance by training other young people in urban survival techniques and infiltration methods, her natural leadership abilities emerging as she helped coordinate rescue missions that had saved hundreds of civilians from fortress detention facilities. The intelligence gathered by the resistance painted a disturbing picture of America divided into military-controlled zones, with corrupt commanders competing for territory and resources while using zombie hordes as weapons against civilian populations who refused to submit to authoritarian rule. Chief Kim revealed that several fortress cities had already fallen not to zombie attacks but to internal rebellions as desperate civilians rose up against their oppressors, though these victories often came at terrible cost as the military used their biological weapons to punish entire communities for resisting. Jake learned that his brother Tommy had survived the initial outbreak and was leading a resistance cell in Arizona, working to document war crimes and gather evidence that could be used to prosecute the conspirators once legitimate government was restored to the country. The resistance had established contact with surviving members of Congress and federal judges who were operating from secure locations, preparing legal cases against the military conspirators while coordinating with international allies who were horrified by the collapse of American democracy. As Jake stood in the communications center listening to reports from resistance cells across the nation, he realized that the underground movement represented the true spirit of America, ordinary citizens willing to risk everything to preserve the values of freedom, justice, and democracy that had defined their country for over 2 centuries. Dr. Vasquez approached him with her latest research findings, explaining that she had not only perfected a cure for the zombie infection but had also developed a way to reverse the genetic modifications in the virus, potentially turning it into a vaccine that could immunize the population against future biological attacks. The weight of responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders as he understood that the resistance was preparing for a coordinated offensive against the fortress cities, a campaign that would determine whether America would be reborn as a free nation or permanently transformed into the authoritarian nightmare that General Hayes and her conspirators had envisioned. Dr. Vasquez stared at the complex molecular diagrams covering the resistance laboratory walls, her exhausted eyes reflecting both triumph and desperation as she explained to Jake that while she had successfully synthesized a working cure for the zombie infection, producing it in quantities large enough to save the remaining American population would require specialized equipment located only at the CDC's Emergency Research Facility in Atlanta. The mission to retrieve this equipment had become the resistance's highest priority, but intelligence reports indicated that Atlanta had become a war zone where 3 different fortress commanders were fighting for control while zombie hordes roamed freely through the abandoned streets, making it one of the most dangerous locations in what remained of the United States. Jake accepted leadership of the mission despite knowing that General Hayes had placed a substantial bounty on his head and was actively hunting him with Special Forces teams equipped with advanced tracking technology and authorization to kill on sight. The strike team that assembled for the Atlanta mission represented the best of the resistance movement. Marcus had volunteered despite his communications expertise being desperately needed at headquarters. Amy insisted on joining because her urban survival skills had proven invaluable in previous operations. Nicole chose to participate as the team's medic despite her father's protests, and Chief Kim assigned his most trusted lieutenant, former Marine Captain David Torres, to provide military expertise for what everyone knew was essentially a suicide mission. Their journey across the infected landscape of America took them through communities that had found ways to survive outside the fortress system, including a farming collective in Tennessee where families had learned to coexist with small numbers of infected by creating noise barriers and scent masking techniques, and a mountain settlement in North Carolina where former park rangers had established sustainable hunting and gathering practices that allowed them to remain completely independent of military control. These encounters reminded Jake that the human spirit of cooperation and innovation had not been completely crushed by the crisis, and that ordinary Americans were finding ways to rebuild their lives based on mutual aid and democratic decision-making rather than authoritarian control. However, the team also witnessed the aftermath of General Hayes' biological warfare campaigns, passing through ghost towns where entire populations had been deliberately infected as punishment for resisting fortress authority, their abandoned homes serving as grim monuments to the depths of evil that the military conspirators were willing to embrace in pursuit of their twisted vision. The pursuit by Hayes' Special Forces became more intense as they approached Atlanta, with the team forced to abandon their vehicles and travel on foot through dense forests where military helicopters conducted regular search patterns and ground teams used trained dogs to track their scent across miles of wilderness terrain. Amy's wilderness survival training proved crucial as she led the group through swamplands and river systems that confused the tracking animals while providing natural concealment from aerial surveillance, though the physical demands of the journey tested everyone's endurance to the breaking point. When they finally reached the outskirts of Atlanta, the city presented a hellscape that surpassed even Jake's worst nightmares from his combat experience, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble by artillery bombardments while fires burned unchecked and the sounds of gunfire echoed constantly from battles between rival fortress factions who cared nothing for the civilian populations caught in their crossfire. The CDC facility itself had become a fortress within a fortress, controlled by a rogue army colonel named Patterson who had declared himself independent from all other military factions and was using the research equipment to develop even more deadly variants of the zombie virus for use as weapons against his enemies. Dr. Vasquez's inside knowledge of the facility's layout proved essential as the team infiltrated the complex through maintenance tunnels, but they quickly discovered that Colonel Patterson had been conducting horrific experiments on captured civilians, using them as test subjects for his biological weapons research in violation of every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The rescue of the equipment became complicated when they encountered other survivors trapped within the facility, including Dr. Michael Chin, a CDC researcher who had been forced to work on Patterson's weapons program under threat of death, and a group of civilian prisoners who begged the resistance team not to abandon them to their fate. Jake faced an agonizing decision between completing the mission that could save millions of lives and risking everything to rescue the immediate victims of Patterson's cruelty, a moral dilemma that tested his leadership and his commitment to the values that separated the resistance from their enemies. As alarms began blaring throughout the facility and Patterson's soldiers closed in on their position, Jake realized that the success of their mission would require sacrifice from someone in the team, and that the hope represented by Dr. Vasquez's cure would come at a price that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The sound of approaching helicopters and the mechanical growls of infected creatures that Patterson had been using as guard animals created a symphony of danger that reminded Jake why this mission had been considered impossible, even as he prepared to make the desperate choices that would determine whether America's future would be defined by the darkness of authoritarian control or the light of scientific hope and human compassion. The CDC facility erupted into chaos as Jake's team fought their way through corridors filled with Colonel Patterson's mutated infected creatures, genetically modified zombies that moved with terrifying speed and intelligence while retaining the insatiable hunger that made them perfect biological weapons for a madman who had lost all connection to his humanity. Dr. Vasquez worked frantically to download critical research data and dismantle the specialized equipment they needed while explosions rocked the building from the ongoing battle between Patterson's forces and the advancing troops of General Hayes, who had arrived in Atlanta with overwhelming firepower and a determination to eliminate both the resistance team and her rival fortress commander. Marcus had established a communication link with the Resistance headquarters, coordinating with Chief Kim to ensure that extraction helicopters would be waiting at a predetermined location. But the rapidly deteriorating situation made it clear that not everyone would survive the mission that had become a desperate race against time and overwhelming odds. Amy demonstrated remarkable courage as she led the rescued civilian prisoners through the facility's maze-like structure, her knowledge of urban survival techniques proving invaluable as she found alternate routes around collapsed sections and avoided areas where Patterson's experimental creatures had been released to hunt down any intruders. Nicole worked alongside Dr. Chin to stabilize wounded civilians who had been subjected to Patterson's horrific medical experiments, her nursing skills pushed to the limit as she treated injuries that no medical school could have prepared her for, while trying to maintain hope in the face of suffering that challenged her faith in human decency. The turning point came when Patterson himself appeared in the laboratory, a scarred and hollow-eyed man whose descent into madness was evident in his rambling speeches about genetic superiority and the necessity of using biological weapons to create a new world order free from the weakness of democratic compassion. Jake found himself facing the colonel in hand-to-hand combat while Dr. Vasquez completed her work, the two men representing opposing visions of what America could become. One driven by fear and the desire for control, the other motivated by hope and the belief that ordinary people deserved better than the nightmare their leaders had created. During their brutal fight, Patterson revealed that the zombie outbreak had been planned for over a decade by a shadow network of military and corporate leaders who believed that democracy had made America weak and vulnerable, requiring a catastrophic reset that would allow them to rebuild the nation according to their authoritarian principles. The revelation that the conspiracy reached back years before the actual outbreak filled Jake with rage as he realized how many innocent lives had been sacrificed to feed the ambitions of men who viewed their fellow citizens as expendable resources in their quest for absolute power. Marcus made the ultimate sacrifice when he realized that General Hayes' forces were about to overrun their position, deliberately triggering an explosion that sealed off the laboratory section and gave the rest of the team time to escape, but not before ensuring that Dr. Vasquez's cure data had been successfully transmitted to resistance cells across the country. As the building burned around them and the sounds of battle raged outside, Amy stepped forward to assume leadership responsibilities that no teenager should have to bear, coordinating the evacuation with a maturity and decisiveness that reminded Jake of the best officers he had served with during his military career. Dr. Vasquez successfully retrieved the equipment and research materials needed to mass-produce the cure, but the emotional cost of Marcus's death weighed heavily on the team as they realized that their friend's sacrifice had saved not just their mission but potentially the future of American democracy itself. The escape from Atlanta became a running battle through streets filled with burning buildings, abandoned vehicles, and hordes of infected creatures that had been released by the various military factions as weapons against their enemies, creating a hellscape that served as a metaphor for what America had become under the rule of those who valued power over human life. Nicole proved her strength under fire as she helped carry wounded civilians to the extraction point while treating their injuries during brief moments of relative safety, her determination to save lives providing hope and inspiration to everyone around her. The helicopter evacuation was complicated by General Hayes' aerial pursuit, leading to a dramatic chase across the Georgia countryside as resistance pilots used their knowledge of the terrain to evade military aircraft that had superior firepower but less familiarity with the landscape they were trying to control. As they flew toward the safety of the resistance base, Jake looked back at the burning ruins of Atlanta and understood that they had witnessed both the depths of human evil and the heights of human courage, with Marcus's sacrifice serving as a reminder that some principles were worth dying for. Dr. Vasquez held the cure data close to her chest while tears streamed down her face, knowing that Marcus's death had made possible the salvation of millions of Americans who would never know the name of the communications expert who had given his life to ensure their freedom. Amy sat quietly beside the rescued civilians, her young face bearing an expression of determination that suggested she understood the weight of the responsibility that history had placed on her generation, the burden of rebuilding a nation that had been nearly destroyed by the greed and ambition of those who had forgotten what it meant to be American. 3 months after Marcus's heroic sacrifice in Atlanta, Jake stood on the observation deck of the restored Capitol building in Washington, D.C., watching as construction crews worked alongside former fortress soldiers to rebuild the monuments that had been damaged during the brief but decisive civil war that had finally ended the military conspiracy's reign of terror across America. The cure that Dr. Vasquez had perfected using the Atlanta equipment had been distributed through Chief Kim's resistance network with remarkable efficiency, clearing entire states of the zombie infection while simultaneously exposing the artificial nature of the outbreak to a population that demanded justice for those who had orchestrated the catastrophe. General Hayes and her surviving conspirators now awaited trial in federal prison, their fortress cities having fallen one by one as civilian populations rose up with the support of loyal military units that had refused to participate in the authoritarian coup attempt. Jake had reluctantly accepted appointment as Director of National Recovery, a position that required him to coordinate the massive effort of rebuilding not just the physical infrastructure of America but also the democratic institutions that had been nearly destroyed by those who had exploited the crisis for their own gain. Dr. Vasquez continued her research at a new CDC facility where transparency and ethical oversight ensured that her work would benefit all humanity rather than serving the agenda of power-hungry extremists, while her development of a permanent vaccine promised to protect future generations from similar biological warfare attacks. Amy had become the youngest person ever elected to Congress, her experiences during the crisis having given her a unique understanding of both the fragility of democratic institutions and the resilience of ordinary Americans when they unite around common principles of justice and mutual aid. Nicole worked as Chief Medical Officer for the National Recovery Administration, leading efforts to rebuild the healthcare system according to principles that prioritized public health over profit and ensuring that the medical profession would never again be corrupted by those who viewed human life as expendable. Chief Kim had been appointed as the new Director of Homeland Security, his resistance experience having taught him the importance of protecting civil liberties while maintaining national security, and his reforms ensured that federal law enforcement would never again be used as a tool of oppression against the American people. The rebuilding process had not been without challenges, as different regions of the country struggled to overcome the trauma of the crisis and the divisions that had been exploited by the conspirators, but the shared experience of surviving the outbreak had created a new sense of national unity based on mutual respect rather than fear. Tommy had survived the Arizona resistance and was now working with Jake to establish veteran support programs that addressed the unique psychological wounds inflicted by a crisis where Americans had been forced to fight against their own military, a situation that challenged traditional concepts of patriotism and service. The trials of the conspiracy leaders had revealed the full scope of their crimes, including evidence that they had planned to use similar biological weapons against other democratic nations, making their defeat a victory not just for America but for the cause of human freedom around the world. International observers praised the American people's ability to restore democratic government after coming so close to permanent authoritarian rule, with the resistance movement serving as an inspiration for pro-democracy activists in countries facing their own struggles against military coups and extremist movements. Dr. Chin, the CDC researcher they had rescued from Atlanta, had provided crucial testimony that led to the conviction of dozens of military and corporate leaders who had participated in the conspiracy, his courage in speaking truth to power serving as a reminder that individual moral choices could determine the fate of entire nations. The memorial service for Marcus and the other resistance fighters who had died defending democracy became an annual national holiday called Freedom Day, ensuring that future generations would remember the sacrifice required to preserve the principles that made America worth defending. As Jake walked through the streets of a Washington, D.C. that was slowly returning to life, he saw evidence everywhere of the new America that was emerging from the ashes of the old. Community gardens planted in formerly vacant lots, neighborhood councils making local decisions through democratic participation, and young people like Amy taking leadership roles in a government that had been renewed by its brush with destruction. The zombie outbreak had ended, but the real victory was not the defeat of the infected creatures but the triumph of ordinary Americans who had refused to allow fear and crisis to destroy the values that defined their nation's character. Dr. Vasquez's research had evolved beyond merely curing the infection to studying how communities could build resilience against future threats, her work showing that the strongest defense against those who would exploit crisis for personal gain was an informed and engaged citizenry committed to democratic principles. Nicole often visited the memorial wall where Marcus's name was inscribed alongside thousands of other Americans who had died defending their country from enemies both foreign and domestic, her medical work serving as a living tribute to those who had sacrificed everything so that others might live in freedom. As the sun set over the renewed capital city, Jake felt a profound sense of hope for the future, knowing that while the price of freedom had been higher than anyone could have imagined, the American people had proven once again that democracy could survive even the darkest challenges when ordinary citizens found the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost.